We sat through the Mike Elias day one of camp presser, and guess what? This year, we avoided injury disaster. I'll break down the updates Elias gave us and answer some Orioles questions coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Thursday, February 13th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on this live episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, we're going to jump into all the Orioles injury notes that we got from GM Mike Elias on Thursday. It was the first workout of spring training for the Orioles, and every year, Mike Elias talks to the media on the day of the first workout and gives you the injury updates about injuries you didn't know about that happened in the thick of the offseason. And as we know, last year, it was an absolute disaster. We heard about Kyle Bradish's elbow issue, which eventually required Tommy John. We heard about John Means not being really ready to go. Ended up he needed another Tommy John. We heard about there was a weird Gunnar Henderson injury that we even got at the beginning of last season. It was a lot of stuff, and it was not good. So I knew I was going to go live on Thursday. I had prepared myself for the worst, and guess what? All things considered, not too bad what we heard from Mike Elias on Thursday. So I'll jump into those injury updates, Felix Bautista, Trevor Rogers, Jorge Mateo, and more. And then at the end of the show, going to answer some mailbag questions. So make sure to get your Orioles questions in the chat right here on YouTube. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube page. If you put those comments and questions in here, we will get to them at the end of the show. But let's start with the Orioles injury updates from Thursday. Again, not too bad. And let's start with the biggest name that was mentioned in those updates, and that is Felix Bautista, who, of course, was injured all the way back in August of 2023 at the end of one of the greatest relief seasons in Orioles history. Missed the rest of the year. It was an elbow issue. The O's tried to get him back for the postseason. Couldn't do it. And it turned out he needed Tommy John surgery. He got TJ in October of 2023. And the Orioles told us then, hey, Felix is going to be out for the entirety of the 2024 season. And that is what happened. He came back. He was rehabbing. He was throwing some bullpens right at the end of last year. But we knew he wasn't coming back last season. However, it gave him a lot more chance to rehab because in theory, if the Orioles had played games in, I don't know, November, December, like Felix could have been ready to go. So we figured, okay, an entire full offseason, a full healthy offseason, he should be good. And that has been the word from Mike Elias, what we've heard from him sparingly throughout the offseason. And the latest update was not 100%, but was certainly positive from Mike Elias, who said on Thursday that Felix Bautista has, quote, a very good chance of being ready for opening day. Elias said Bautista is doing great. He's throwing bullpens, but they still are saying, which is what they've said throughout the offseason, that they're going to build him up slow and not take any risks. Because although it seems like he is fully healthy, there is nothing with the elbow that he's dealing with. Remember, he had a follow-up surgery. I believe it was in February or March of last year after the original Tommy John in October. Doesn't seem like anything's bothering him. They just want that ramp up to be as careful as possible so that there isn't any kind of re-injury, or at least they can knock down some of the risk of that re-injury. So they don't want to take a lot of risks. He, according to Elias, is not going to throw in a lot of actual spring training games. Most of his work is going to happen on the backfields, out of the game scenarios. Then Elias said later into spring. So as we get into mid-March probably is when we'll start seeing Felix on the mound in spring training games just to get his feet wet in a game scenario before opening day. Now, again, Elias did say very good chance of being ready for opening day. Definitely seems like Bautista's on that pace to be good. But he did not say definitively, hey, Felix Bautista is going to be ready on opening day, barring any setbacks. And that tells me that there is still a chance he does open the 2025 season on the injured list. I would say more likely than not, he's on that opening day roster. But for me, in the experience since Elias took over in November of 2018, if he says anything about a player even possibly not being ready for opening day, and he still left that door at least a crack open when talking about Felix on Thursday, it means there's a possibility of it happening. And if I had to guess, if I was a betting man on this, I would actually say that Felix begins the year on the 15-day injured list. He misses those first 15 days just to ramp up a little bit more. And then as soon as it's day 16 of the season, he is activated and joins the Oriole bullpen. Now, whether that comes on day 16 or on opening day, the Orioles have been clear. Hey, he is not going to pitch a lot of back-to-backs early in the season. He's not going to get every single save chance in April and May. They're going to slow play it as much as they can because, hey, they want him to be fully ready, rearing to go like old Felix in the second half of this season and into the postseason. So if that means they slow play him early in the year, coming off his first ever major injury, I think I am okay with that. Now, if Felix does start the year on the IL, that does shuffle some things in terms of this Oriole bullpen. When we thought, and again, still very possible it could happen, that Bautista would be on the opening day roster, my projected bullpen looked like this. 8 relievers in there, Felix as your closer. Your high leverage setup guys are Sir Anthony Dominguez, Andrew Kittredge, Yennier Cano, and Gregory Soto. Then you have a couple more lefties in Cionel Perez and Keegan Aiken. And then Albert Suarez as the long man was that bullpen. Now, if you think that, and it's possible again, and I think it could happen, Felix starts the year on the injured list, I keep the other 7 in the bullpen, Dominguez, Kittredge, Cano, Soto, Perez, Aiken, and Suarez, but it opens up one spot for what I think will probably be a fight between 4 players. I would say Colin Selby, Matt Bowman, Brian Baker, and Cade Povich would be the 4 pitchers, because this assumes Povich does not have a rotation spot, would be the 4 pitchers fighting for that spot. Now, if they went with Povich, I could see it happening. I don't know if they'd carry 2 long relievers. Maybe they would. Maybe they'd like the upside of Povich to be on the roster and easily step in if they needed a spot start early in the year. But I feel like they'd rather him just be starting games in AAA and be ready to go whenever they need him to be a starter in the big leagues. So then you have Selby, Bowman, and Baker, all who pitched at least a little bit for the Orioles last season. I do think Colin Selby is the best reliever and has the best stuff of those 3 guys. But Selby has options, so he can just be sent down to AAA Norfolk. Matt Bowman is back on a minor league deal, which means he can also just be sent to AAA without going through waivers. But for the first time in his career, Brian Baker is out of minor league options. And even though I've been a Brian Baker apologist for a while, I'm kind of off that train. If you made me rank all 3 of those guys, I would rank them Selby, Bowman, Baker. I honestly think that last spot would go to Brian Baker for those first 15 days. Because right now, I don't see Baker making this opening day roster. Unless there are injuries that come up in camp, Baker is on the outside looking in this bullpen. And because he is out of options, the Orioles would have to place him on waivers. And his stuff is good enough that a bad rebuilding team would most likely make a claim on Brian Baker and put him as a middle reliever in their bullpen and see what they can get out of him. I think the Orioles would say, well, if we're going to lose him for nothing, we might as well keep him around for an extra 2 weeks as kind of the last guy in the bullpen and see if we can continue to work with him and maybe something clicks. If it doesn't, we DFA Baker 15 days into the season when Felix comes back. And if it does, well, then we have another good arm in there and you kind of make that decision when it comes to it. But I think it would go to Baker, but easily could be Selby or Bowman or maybe even Cade Povich if they wanted a little more length in that Oriole bullpen at the beginning of the year if they did not have Felix Bautista. Now, speaking of pitching, really the one new injury that we learned about, it was kind of incredible that we only truly learned about one new injury, and that was to a player who I don't think anyone projects to make the Orioles opening day roster. It was Trevor Rogers was the only guy we learned about from Elias on Thursday that had any kind of new injury that pops up. Turns out when Rogers presumably was re-ramping up his throwing program in January, this, remember, is when Kyle Bradish got hurt last year. Luckily, though, it was not an arm injury for Rogers. He suffered a right kneecap subluxation in January. Rogers basically said on Thursday that it dislocated for a second. His right kneecap, it dislocated and then almost immediately popped back in. So not something he needed to go in for surgery or anything like that. But it definitely is an injury that will destabilize you. For a left-hander, that is your right leg. So that is his plant leg, his landing leg going down the mound. You really don't want that to be destabilized. That can throw off everything when you are landing. So certainly something where, he's going to want to rest that a little bit. Now, Rogers did say he is playing catch right now, but is not ready to throw off a mound yet. Elias didn't have a full timeline, but said he's definitely going to be multiple weeks behind. That was the best he gave us for timeline. The nice thing is, though, for the Orioles, like, again, Rogers was not going to be part of this opening day roster. They traded for him last year. Didn't go well. They sent him to AAA. He still has options, so he can easily begin the year in AAA Norfolk, which was going to be the plan. He was going to be in the Tides rotation to begin the year, but he did work on a lot of things this offseason. And we had a good story from Andy Koska in the Baltimore Banner a couple of weeks ago about what Rogers was specifically working on, getting past the back injury he had, getting his mechanics back down, working on the movement and the release point of his pitches, changing those things. And he did say he felt good about his mechanical tweaks. And he also said his fastball was at 93 miles an hour, which is a good sign. Because remember, when Trevor Rogers was almost winning Rookie of the Year for the Marlins back in 2021, he was throwing 95. When he was struggling with the Marlins and Orioles this year, he was throwing 91. So the fact that he is back to 93 is maybe still not old Trevor Rogers, but that is still a good sign velocity-wise. He tweaked some of his off-speed deliveries. The Orioles still think he can help them this year. It just might be later than they thought. And again, unless the O's have multiple injuries, they weren't going to put Rogers on the opening day roster, and they really weren't going to see a spot where, anytime in even April or maybe even May, they'd have to call up Rogers to use him. He seemed like a guy where as they get later and later into the season, they need more pitching depth. Rogers could certainly be throwing some serious innings for the Orioles in the second half. So you could say, oh, Connor, if he's already throwing, like maybe he misses April and some of May, he's back by June, he's good to go in the second half and he's fine. But remember, it's not just getting him healthy. The Orioles also want to continue working with Trevor Rogers and get him back into those AAA game scenarios in April and May and work on things, pitch mix and delivery and all that stuff in game scenarios. And what this injury, the way it hurts the Orioles is it delays all of that. So they are still trying to fix Trevor Rogers. He's a free agent after 2026, so they still have some time with him. This just kind of delay, even with the good work they've done this offseason, kind of delays that process, which is unfortunate for the Orioles and unfortunate for Rogers. But again, if your worst injury you're learning from Elias is a guy who's, only going to be delayed to the season, a guy who wasn't even going to be on the opening day roster, this press conference feels a whole lot better than the one last year did. But there were a couple more updates to get to. Update on Jorge Mateo's injury and some updates on just some other guys who are not in camp just yet. We will get to those coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Wonderful Pistachios. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. Now, for me, when I am eating pistachios, I want the shell in there. I want to work for that pistachio a little bit. Yeah, it's nice when it's mostly cracked open. You can just pull it right out. I like those pistachios where there's just the tiniest opening. You can barely see it, and you really got to get in there to crack it out. I like to work for it. Maybe it's a Maryland thing. Maybe it's an Eaton Crabs thing. I'm okay having to work for it a little bit. Now, Wonderful Pistachios has that, but if you're someone who just wants those pistachio nuts right in a bag, you want to put your hand in there, grab a bunch and throw them in your mouth, that is fine too. Wonderful Pistachios got it all. They're the perfect grab-and-go snack in that way. So get snackin' and get crackin' with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. So those pistachios might be wonderful. What was not wonderful is a couple of the injury updates that we got from Mike Elias on Thursday. Nothing too bad. We talked about Felix Bautista and we talked about Trevor Rogers. The last big one was Jorge Mateo. Now, Mateo had that nasty-looking elbow injury in Miami in August. He missed the remainder of the season, actually ended up undergoing ligament surgery, basically Tommy John surgery on his left elbow, his non-throwing elbow, which is why there was still a chance for him to even be ready for opening day, because again, it's not really the throwing that is an issue. It is the swinging for Mateo. He got that surgery on August 28th, and Elias all offseason has basically been like, hey, maybe he could be, maybe he starts the season late. It was kind of wishy-washy when asked about Mateo and his couple of times he spoke to the media throughout the offseason. He was more definitive on Thursday. Elias saying kind of officially Jorge Mateo will not be ready for opening day. he will start the season on the injured list. Now, we had assumed that really since the Orioles started signing outfielders, and in back-to-back weeks, they signed Dylan Carlson and Ramon Laureano. Those were indicators that, hey, they're signing guys for the bottom part of the roster, right-handed hitters who can play the outfield. Probably means Mateo is not going to be ready at the beginning of the year. And now we know. Now, Mateo said he's been without the elbow brace for a while. He was running sprints at the first workout on Thursday, but he said he's still only swinging with one hand, having some issues there. Elias said you could see him in spring training games, maybe very late in March. The last couple of games we could see him out there, but it still wouldn't make him ready for opening day. He's probably going to go on the IL, then I'm sure is going to play some rehab games in AAA Norfolk in April or even May before he does come back. Wasn't really a timeline beyond that. It wasn't like, hey, he'll be out for those 10 days and then good to go, or hey, it's going to take a month or more. We really don't know. What we do know is Mateo is going to start the season on the injured list. So officially, that does open up a roster spot. And when you are looking at the projected opening day roster right now, you got your two catchers, and of course, 13 position players. You got your two catchers in Adley Rutschman and Gary Sanchez. You got your 6 infielders, Jackson Holliday, Gunnar Henderson, Jordan Westberg, Ramon Arias, Ryan Mountcastle, and Ryan O'Hearn. And then you got your 4 outfielders in Tyler O'Neill, Cedric Mullins, Heston Kjerstad, and Colton Cowser. So that basically leaves you one spot left on the roster and really 3 main options. It's Coby Mayo, Ramon Laureano, and Dylan Carlson are those 3 main options. And I think it's fairly simple predicting which of those guys will get the spot. Coby Mayo still has some more work to do. His positionally doesn't really fit right now perfectly, and I think they want him to work on some more stuff. He has options. He can easily go to AAA. And I think the Orioles had a plan to make Mateo an utility infielder / 5th outfielder on this roster. So they signed those 2 outfielders in Carlson and Laureano to have a true 5th outfielder. So that's what I think they're going to go with. And here's the big difference between the two. Well, number one is Laureano was much better last year and probably is much better right now as a hitter, so he probably helps you more. And B, Dylan Carlson still has minor league options, so you can just send him to AAA Norfolk. Laureano does not. So I think it's fairly easy to see if he stays healthy. Ramon Laureano, who got that 1-year, $4 million deal from the Orioles, is going to get that final roster spot in replacement of Jorge Mateo as Mateo starts the season on the IL. And seems like something where he could maybe miss like the whole month of April, Mateo, and not come back until May. Now, Elias did still say he expects Mateo to be an important part of this team in 2025. He is a free agent after this year. The Orioles do have a club option for 2026 that they could pick up. But, you know, if Mateo comes back maybe mid-May, maybe June 1st, it'll be really interesting to see what the roster looks like at that point. Is there other injuries? How he kind of fits back on the roster? Because if Laureano jumps in there and is playing well and Coby Mayo is playing well in AAA and there's not a lot of injuries, like there may not be a spot for Mateo. Like I'm not saying he's going to get Wally pipped because he's not exactly a starter to begin with, but it might be tough to squeeze Mateo back on the roster whenever he comes back. So that is certainly something interesting to watch there. Now, a couple more player updates. 2 pitchers who were on the 40-man did not report on pitchers and catchers report day on Wednesday. One was Tomoyuki Sugano, who the Orioles signed out of Japan to a 1-year deal this offseason, kind of projects to be the number 5 starter right now. He is still in Japan, kind of working on obtaining his work visa, although Elias did say that the Orioles expect him to be on a plane to Florida as early as Friday, so they expect him to potentially be in Sarasota this weekend, so just a couple of days delayed in getting here. If that's the case, if it's only delayed by a couple of days, it shouldn't be any issue for him to be ready to roll in the opening day rotation for the Orioles. Zach Eflin is also not reported to camp because congratulations to him and his family. His wife just had their 4th child, and I believe there are 4 fairly young kids. So good luck to Zach Eflin and his family on that one. But of course, congratulations to them. So he'll be a couple of days late, it would seem, as well. And then 2 players for the Orioles that they had DFA'd last week and the week before cleared waivers. Emmanuel Rivera was the first one. He accepted his assignment to AAA with the Orioles. He had the option to decline it and become a free agent, but if he declined it, he would have forfeited the guaranteed $1 million he would have made this year. And I don't know if Rivera thought he could get a guaranteed $1 million anywhere else. So he goes to AAA, goes off the 40-man roster, gets his $1 million. He will now be a non-roster invitee, will be in big league spring training, and he could technically also be a competitor for that open Jorge Mateo roster spot. It's not likely, but he is good depth to have in AAA. And then Daz Cameron is in the same spot. He was DFA'd last week when the Orioles reclaimed Roansy Contreras on waivers. Cameron had come over from the A's earlier this offseason. Cameron also cleared waivers, and he had the right to deny it, but did accept a AAA assignment to stay with the Orioles instead of becoming a free agent. And also, you can throw Daz Cameron into the mix along with Dylan Carlson and Ramon Laureano, kind of competing for that final right-handed hitting outfield spot with Mateo on the IL. But again, Cameron, at least below Laureano and probably below Carlson in terms of talent at this point. You can now just send him to AAA. He'll be in big league camp, but I expect him, like Rivera, to start in Norfolk, but provide the Orioles some solid depth of some guys who have a good chunk of major league experience. But those are all the big updates we got from Mike Elias. I guess the other ones were Grayson Rodriguez feels fine and ready to go after missing the last 2 months of the year last year with that lat injury, and Jackson Holliday is even more yoked now than he was in the past. So Jackson Holliday up arrow in 2025. Those are the big updates. Otherwise, let's take some Orioles questions. Put your questions in the chat function if you're watching live here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, and I'll get to them coming up after this break. So let's get to your Orioles questions here to finish off this live show. Thank you to everyone who's tuning in here live on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. And of course, everyone who's listening after the fact. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. If you can leave a 5-star rating and a review over there, it really helps out the show. And thank you to everyone who has shown their interest and signed up for the Locked On Orioles Fantasy Baseball Leagues. Got so much interest, we ended up doing 3 leagues. Actually had so much interest, could have done more, but just not having the time to juggle more than 3 leagues. We did fill the open spots we had in the final league. So thank you to everyone who reached out, hoping to continue those leagues in the years in the future, but should be something fun we are doing here on the podcast. Let's jump into your questions. Did get a couple questions via email that I want to get to first. We'll start with a question from Isabel, who asks, if the Orioles stand pat in terms of their rotation, how confident are you in this current rotation against the other AL East teams that have improved their rosters? Now, I'm going to take this question from Isabel and just comparing the rotations, because the AL East is good, right? The Red Sox just added Alex Bregman to their team. Like, there's some good talent in this division, as we know, but I wanted to just go team by team. So the Orioles, if they don't make another move, and it's still possible to do a Dylan Cease trade, we'll talk about that in a moment, but their rotation would probably be something like Zach Eflin, Grayson Rodriguez, Charlie Morton, Dean Kramer, Tomoyuki Sugano. Now let's start with the Blue Jays. Projected rotation for them: Kevin Gausman, Jose Barrios, Chris Bassett, Max Scherzer, Bowden Francis. I'm taking the Blue Jays in that one. Their strength right now on that team is their rotation. I am taking Toronto over Baltimore. The Boston Red Sox, projected rotation: Garrett Crochet, Tanner Houck, Brian Bayo, Cutter Crawford, Walker Buehler, and then Lucas Giolito, although he might be on the IL to start the year. So really it's Crochet, Houck, Bayo, Crawford, and Buehler. That one is pretty interesting. That's a rotation that did really well early last year and really struggled late in the year. Of course, they added Garrett Crochet, so they have probably someone with a higher upside than a lot of Orioles guys do, although don't sleep on the upside for Grayson Rodriguez. Maybe it's a little bit of a homer pick, but I got to see more from guys like Buehler and Bayo and Houck to really believe in them. I'm going to take the Orioles rotation over the Red Sox rotation. Then we go to the Yankees projected rotation: Garrett Cole, Max Fried, Carlos Rodon, Luis Gil, and Clark Schmidt. Yeah, that's the Yankees. They probably have the best rotation in the American League East right now. I am going to take New York. And then finally, the Tampa Bay Rays projected rotation is Shane McClanahan, very much coming off injury, then Taj Bradley, Ryan Pepio, Zach Littell, Shane Baz, and Drew Rasmussen. In terms of talent, that's better than the Orioles, but there are so many injury questions in that rotation. Maybe I give the slight edge to them over the Orioles, but it's pretty close. So I would say Toronto better, Yankees better, then maybe Rays, maybe not, then Orioles, then Red Sox for me. So I'd put the Orioles either third or fourth with their rotations. If they went and got a Dylan Cease, I'd put them clearly over the Rays and more in line with what the Blue Jays throw out there. But at that point, that's kind of where I see the Orioles rotation, at least at this moment. Again, these things can absolutely change. And question from John, also from email: hey, Connor, what are your thoughts looking back on the Trevor Rogers deal? It was good for depth, but how nice would it be to have Connor Norby as legit trade chip for an ace right now. Now, we've already talked about Trevor Rogers having the kneecap dislocation. Can't be a very fun injury. Looking back on the trade, I've talked about it a little bit on the show so far this offseason when we kind of learn more about what kind of adjustments that Rogers made. Really what I'll say is the trade is a loss so far, but not in the way that some people think about it. I think too many are focused on the Norby, Stowers, losing those guys part of the trade. Really, I think the trade is an L right now because you haven't gotten anything from Trevor Rogers. He gave you 4 bad starts. He went to AAA, and now he's injured to start this year. That's not what you wanted out of that trade. At the very least, you wanted a guy who could give you some depth and actually start games for you all the way down the stretch and maybe into the postseason last year, or at the very least, a guy who could be a part of your starting 5 to begin the year this year, and they didn't get either of those things out of Trevor Rogers. I think too many people focus on Norby and Stowers. And when you separate them from Rogers, obviously you would have liked to get a better starter out of those two guys, but how much value do they really have? These were guys already in their mid-20s who kind of graduated from any kind of prospect status they had. Connor Norby was a back-end top 100 guy at a point, but we're never really like true across-the-board top 100 prospects. Stowers showed a lot of swing and miss issues when he got to the big leagues, questions about his bat. Norby's bat I really like, but really has no defensive position, and there are some struggles there as well. There's a ceiling for these guys, and yeah, of course, they're going to play almost every day for the Marlins this year, but that's because the Marlins have no hitter. So we are going to learn a lot about Stowers and Norby in Miami in 2025, but also think about how would they have fit on this Baltimore roster. Like, you're looking at this team right now, the Orioles could have absolutely used Connor Norby down the stretch last year with all the injuries they had, could have absolutely used a right-handed infielder in Connor Norby. On this opening day roster right now, I would argue that neither Connor Norby nor Kyle Stowers would make this team. You could say, hey, Norby would take the spot of Arias and Stowers could take the spot of Ramon Laureano, and I could listen to those arguments, but at best, they would be players number 12 and 13 among the hitters on your roster, and at worst, they could both be AAA guys again to begin this year. And long-term, Norby's not really a utility infielder because he's not a good defender, and he's not, I don't think, going to play when it comes down to it over Westberg, Henderson, or Holiday in the infield. And for Stowers in the outfield, gives you solid defense, left-handed bat. He's a nice piece to have on a team. But are you going to play him consistently over Cowser or O'Neill? No. And he can't really play center field, so he doesn't take Mullen's spot away. And I'd rather give the at-bats to, Kirstad's just a better player, better hitter, full stop than Stowers. I don't see a path forward for playing time with those guys on this team. So separate that. Yeah, I think they were expendable. Separate that from Rogers, who has been a failure so far. But again, the Orioles have him for another 2 seasons. If they can get something out of Rogers to help them win games, even if it's as a reliever, this trade will go more towards the middle than the L side of it. But that's kind of how I feel about it at this moment. All right, let's take some questions from the chat here. First question from Shane. I thought the Padres were cash-strapped. Does a big signing make a cease trade even more likely? They did sign Nick Pivetta to a 4-year, $55 million deal, and then they signed Kyle Hart to a 1-year deal a little bit later. So the Padres have added 2 starting pitchers in the last 2 days. I certainly think it makes it more likely, maybe. Dennis Lin of The Athletic did report yesterday that the Padres are probably going to hold on to Cease and Michael King, but adding 2 starters makes it more possible for them to make a trade. They are cash strapped. The way they got around that is they backloaded Pivetta's deal. They're only paying him like $1 or $2 million in 2025. Then he's going to make all the money in the next 3 years of the deal. And Hart was a very cheap deal as well. But if they are still cash strapped moving forward, $14 million for Cease, a guy they're not going to bring back, it's still possible they could trade him. I think it makes it slightly more likely, not a lot more likely, but definitely Shane slightly more likely at this point. And also, because Pivetta had the qualifying offer attached, the Padres are going to lose a draft pick. I believe they will lose pick number 64. The Orioles are able to trade pick number 71 in this upcoming draft. Wouldn't that be a nice replacement for the Padres to get their draft pick back in a Dylan Cease trade? I think it is certainly still on the table. Doug Dimmadome, owner of the Dimsdale Dimmadome, with a question here. Thoughts on the Orioles all-orange uniforms coming back? Also, Tyler O'Neill and Jackson Holiday looking jacked. Start with the uniforms. Yeah, we saw UniWatch report that they're coming back. We saw kind of the leaked Grayson Rodriguez all-orange uni bobblehead the Orioles are giving out. Looks like orange unis are coming back. I love it. Like, I know when they wore them for that one game like 10, 15 years ago, the players didn't love them. I love the all-orange unis. Wear them, 10 times, 15 times this year, whatever it is. I'm all in for cool uniform stuff and all orange. I'm very in. Also, Tyler O'Neill and Jackson looking jacked. Well, Tyler O'Neill has always been jacked, so not a surprise there. Jackson Holiday being jacked, though, that is fun to see, and hopefully it turns into some more hits on the field for him and for the Orioles. Enjoy life with a question here. With our current roster, where do you see them getting reps for Coby Mayo early in the season? Honestly, with the current roster, and if everybody stays healthy, as I just kind of talked about what the roster is going to look like on opening day, I don't see a lot of reps for Mayo early in the season. I think Mayo starts the year in AAA, plays a lot of third base, plays a lot of first base. He's in there every day hitting second, third, or fourth for the Norfolk Tides and just continuing to get reps, getting defensive reps, working on his swing. And at some point, something's going to happen. An injury, somebody's going to start struggling, whatever it may be, something's going to open up for the Orioles. And I think by the second half, Coby Mayo is going to have a role. Maybe it's even Ryan Mountcastle gets traded for a pitcher at the deadline and Mayo comes up and takes his spot, whatever it may be. Just be patient with Mayo. It's a good problem to have, right? He's good depth in AAA right now, but I think by the second half, that chance is coming for him. I don't see the reps. Unless somebody gets injured, I just do not see the reps right now for him with the Orioles. Question here from Don't Mind Me, I'm just spectating. Do you think with the state of this rotation that this team runs a risk of finishing in third place and getting lapped with the Red Sox, who seem to be trying harder this offseason even before signing Bregman? I think it's absolutely a possibility the Orioles would finish third in this division. We've seen some projections so far. Pacoda had 89 wins. Zips had 89 wins. The FanGraphs projections had 84 wins. It's kind of been all over the map from first to third place. I think third place is a possibility. The Yankees, even with losing Juan Soto, I don't think you can say the Yankees got better because, again, they lost Juan Soto, but they're still a very good team. They look like the favorites in this division. I would still put the Orioles second. FanGraphs has the Orioles as the number one projected position player war team. Like, they have the best projection of combined position players of any team in Major League Baseball. That is pretty exciting to what the Orioles will have 1 through 9 in that lineup and among their bench guys as well. It's a really good bullpen. Yes, the rotation is lacking a number one, but it's got a lot of depth at the end. I think the Orioles could finish in third. That they could still easily make the playoffs as a third place team. I think the Orioles right now look like a second place team who gets in as a wild card. I don't know if they have the rotation to win a World Series. If they add an ace at the deadline or in the next couple of weeks, that could change. But yeah, they're of course a risk of getting third. If I had to project it right now, I'd put them in second place at the moment. Dental Office with a question. Who do you think is best, Carlson, Laureano, or Daz Cameron? I said it earlier. Yeah, Ramon Laureano is the best player right now. Carlson has the highest upside because he's younger and has things to fix. And Daz Cameron, I think the Orioles just like Daz Cameron. And that is why he is here. Dental Office with another question. Any chance Cade Povich goes to number 5 in the rotation spot and Sugano becomes the closer until Felix comes back? I will tell you right now, if Tomoyuki Sugano is the closer on opening day, I think I'd be done. I would quit this podcast. I would just leave. That would be one of the more shocking things I have ever seen. It's not a closer fastball. It's starter stuff. It's a starter mix. He is a starting pitcher. Now, there's a chance that if the Orioles were to go and get a top line starter, that maybe Sugano would get pushed to be the long man in the bullpen. He could be a long reliever. He is not going to be anybody's closer. If Felix does start the year on the IL, Seranthony Dominguez will get some save chances. Gregory Soto will get some save chances. Andrew Kittredge and your Cano. They'll play the matchups until Felix comes back. I would doubt Sugano would get that spot. I think there could be a chance if Povich is really good, he could outpitch Sugano and win the number 5 rotation spot in camp. But just because Povich has options, Sugano does not. The Orioles went out and got Sugano. It's more likely he would get that spot. I cannot see him, though, being the closer for this team. Walter with a question here. Aside from Grayson Rodriguez and Kyle Bradish, which prospect starter do you think has the most upside potential? It's a good question. I mean, upside for me is Chase McDermott. I think the pitch mix is so good. High ride fastball, really good breaking balls. I think he has fantastic upside, like where he could turn into something really, really special. He could also just be a good reliever, and that could be his career. That's totally fine. Now, for guys who are further away from the big leagues, like everybody is on the Michael Ferret train right now. He is shooting up some of these prospect boards, which is really fun to see. If the Orioles can get Kiefer Lord back, he got Tommy John surgery last year, so who knows if he's going to pitch much at all this year, but draft pick out of Washington a couple of years ago. Like, I love Kiefer Lord's stuff. And I think, this is 3-4 years down the road. He could be a really good starting pitcher at the major league level for the Orioles. Let's see. Next question here. We've got Raven Lunatic. Thoughts on Cedric Mullins having a sneaky great season in 2025? It could happen, right? Like, he's still got the juice in there. Mullins was really, really good in the second half last year. If you can carry that over, it is his contract year. Right now, if you made me guess, like, Cedric Mullins would not be getting a lot of money in free agency next winter unless he turns it on this year. We've seen plenty of players in all sports, when they're set to hit free agency, they can take it to a next level. And Cedric Mullins could be one of those guys who could potentially do that. Golfer with a question here. What is the payroll looking like right now? The Orioles are pushing towards $60 million at the moment, or $160 million, I should say. They're actually at $161 million for their projected payroll. That sits 15th in baseball, so they're basically right smack dab in the middle. The Orioles have spent, I believe right now it's the 7th most money of any team this offseason, and they have had the biggest jump in payroll of any team in baseball from 2024 to 2025. They're still middle of the pack. There is still room to grow, but it is nice to see this team that was 28th, 29th in payroll jumping up to now 15th in the league. Doug Dimmadome with another question here. Do you think the Orioles have the best depth in the American League? I would say yes. Where the Orioles are probably lacking at the top of their rotation for top-line talent, they have top-line talent in their lineup, Gunnar Henderson, Adley Rutschman, and others. But you think about all the depth they have pitching-wise. You've got Povich, Suarez, McDermott, Rogers. All those guys are just depth for the starting rotation. You're looking at a guy like Kobe Mayo in AAA. You're looking at Heston Kjerstad, can't get everyday at-bats on this team. Like, that is a lot of depth. I think if they're not number one, they are certainly up there in the American League in terms of depth. We will take one more question here, unless anybody's got a really good one they can put in the chat in the next minute or so. This is a question from Adit. Who is more likely to hit 30 home runs in at least 2 of the next 4 years? Colton Cowser or Jackson Holliday? I would say Colton Cowser. I think he's going to have a more power-based approach, and he's a little more advanced heading into 2025 than Holliday. So I'd say Cowser much more likely to do it this year than Holliday is, which obviously gives him a leg up. So I would say Cowser over Holliday. And then Doug Dimmadome will give him the final question. My last question, who is one Orioles player to look out for in spring training? I mean, I'm super intrigued by Tomoyuki Sugano. Like, what is he going to do getting over to the States? And maybe we don't get a lot of that in spring training. If you're looking for someone different than that, I would say it would be, what does Heston Kjerstad look like in this role, knowing he finally kind of has an opening day roster spot earmarked for him? How does that affect what he looks like in spring training? And then finally, like, watch Samuel Basallo. Just watch him face major league pitching. Might not be pretty all the time. He's 20 years old, but I am so excited to see him in spring training. But that'll do it for this episode. Thank you so much for everyone who tuned in live. Unless the Orioles make some huge, big Valentine's Day move on Friday, no podcast Friday. We will be back on Monday getting you all the updates you need from Orioles spring training, as the rest of the position players should get there around the weekend. And then it's really a full go. Next Saturday is the first spring training game. We learned that the Orioles will have 8 games on Masson, technically better than last year when they had 7 spring training games on Masson. So that's good, I guess. Enjoy life with the final comment. Tough night for the Maryland women. Yeah, that's I'm not in my most chipper of mood. We can't be losing at home by 20 to Nebraska. We cannot be losing at home by 20 to Nebraska. But that is neither here nor there. I'll be back on Monday. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.